Now let's worship him in prayer. Let's come before his throne. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much, so much that we can gather again here tonight. We thank you, Lord, for the hope that we have in Jesus Christ, who brings hope and restoration to broken lives. We thank you that we are not forsaken. We thank you that you claim us as your own, and that there is eternal security in that truth and in that reality. And we thank you, Lord, that by your Spirit, this truth lives in us, that we are yours and you are ours, and that you have a purpose in all that we experience and live out in our days, and that you're fulfilling a good work through us and in us, and you are preparing us for that feast in the house of Zion. And we want to gather by your power and your strength so many more to share that feast with. And we thank you, Lord, that tonight we can learn about what it means to share that love with those who have been exploited, beaten, battered in a sexually perverse world. Lord, we pray that you prepare our hearts to receive what we need to receive tonight. We pray that we will look to you and look to the cross to realize that Christ came for this purpose as well. Lord, we pray that you continue to bless us. Some of us come here with battered spirits and hearts, burdened by weakness of the flesh, but also burdened by loss. We do pray for Nathan and Madeline and the child that was miscarried. Lord, we pray for Madeline tonight as well, and comfort them and encourage them in this time. And give them hope, the hope again of the resurrection, when all things will be restored and we will be together again, even with those children who die in the womb. We think of Rose tonight, Father. I'm sure if she was strong enough, she would love to be here tonight. And yet she's in bed, it seems 24/7 now, and so weak. Fill her with your hope as well, and allow her to see Christ for who he is and what he's done for her, and allow her to have hope in the midst of her pain and suffering. Lord, there are many members here who have family members who are have failing health because of cancer and other reasons, and Lord, we do pray that you will encourage them, strengthen them, and even grant healing by your power. We pray also for the Gunnings tonight, that you will heal Joanne and bless her and bless the family during this time of uncertainty. Lord, so we come to you this evening, and we are so dependent and so desperate for your love and for your grace. We have so much on the table in some ways tonight, and we do pray that you bless Jennifer now. Give her the words to say. Fill her with your Spirit. Use her to impart wisdom and grace to us, and truth and knowledge, even on such a hard subject. Bless the voting tonight and all the other things that we'll be doing after her talk. In Jesus' name, amen. I know that if we can open our Bibles, I know that we read these verses actually two weeks ago with Jeff Nevin, and some of you, of course, were there. So it's Luke chapter 4, and it's the words of Jesus again about his ministry on earth. And I think it's so important that we keep going back to his ministry, because his ministry shapes our ministry. His love shapes our life, our love. His life shapes our life. Everything about Christ is what we want to see happening in us. But not only his ethic and how he lived out his life, but also his ministry, how he served. And we're going to learn a little bit about what it means to be in this service again tonight. So I'm just going to read a few verses from Luke 4:16 through 20. There we read, Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Tonight we're going to learn about a certain type of oppression, a very dark, sinister oppression of primarily young women. And we need to realize that Jesus also, in his power, came to set them free and to provide healing and to proclaim to them as well the year of the Lord's favor, which is what they need in their time of desperation. So we welcome tonight Jennifer Lucking, and we're so thankful that Jennifer is here with us. I just actually met Jennifer tonight, so I don't really know her at all, but we're just so thankful. And I think it was Adrian who brought this contact together. So thank you, Adrian. We're so blessed to have Jennifer here. Jennifer's married to Mark and has a daughter, Amy, who's 5 years old, I learned tonight. And Amy said to her, why do you need to go tonight? And so Jennifer said, well, because this has been planned. Thankful to Adrian. This has been planned for many months. And she said, Amy said, you could just call in sick. I'm glad you didn't. So you went against the wishes of your daughter. So that's, sometimes us parents have to do that. In 2013, they started Restoration Second Stage Homes as an organization. Jennifer was one of the founding members of that organization. They don't quite have a home. They soon will have a home in Aldershot. And last year, Jennifer was elected as the executive director of Restoration. So without further commentary, let's welcome Jennifer, and thank you, Jennifer, for coming. So Jennifer will be speaking to us for 50 minutes to an hour. Afterwards, we'll have questions, and then I think we'll break, and then we'll come back together for some of the logistical stuff that we have to do tonight.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Bless you. I'm really glad I could make it here tonight. I was in Iowa for work last month, and they had booked me even further in advance. They contacted me last January 2018, to speak in April 2019. And then the day before I was supposed to speak, I had to bail on them. My husband was hospitalized, and I felt so badly having to cancel. So I'm very glad to be here tonight with you and not call in sick. My name is Jennifer, and I work for Restoration's Second Stage Homes. And tonight, just to kind of give you an overview of what we're doing tonight, I'm not checking text. I am going to start my timer, because otherwise I can ramble. Oh, I didn't stop it last time, 217 hours. Okay, there we go. I won't go that long tonight. So tonight, we're going to learn a little bit about what human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation looks like in our world, but primarily here in Southern Ontario. Just a disclaimer, I tend to not be too graphic when I speak in public, but I don't know each of you and your experiences and your comfort levels and your hearts and your histories. And so I just wanted to let you know that some of the things we'll hear tonight will be tough to hear. And if you are feeling really unsettled or perhaps triggered because of past experiences, and you need to take a break, I won't be offended if you walk out, or if you need to debrief with me afterwards and just chat a little bit, I'll be here for you. So that's my little disclaimer. We're going to spend a little bit of time learning about what human trafficking looks like and commercial sexual exploitation, and lamenting that a little bit. Then we're going to ponder what our response could be, our response as Christians and as faith communities, and then I'll share a little bit about what Restorations is doing in response. So if we could go to the next slide. just like to start with Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1. And I read this, I think when I first started doing this work around trafficking or anti-trafficking work. And it really brought me a lot of peace knowing that in the Bible, figures in the Bible, people in the Bible, and Jesus could be with me in my own lament about justice in our world. So Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1 says, "Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter." I remember now, I read this verse the summer I was doing my master's research, and I was researching the ways that pimps and traffickers in Canada target, recruit, and condition primarily young women and girls for the sex trade. And as part of this research, I actually read 4 documents, some published books, some self-published books, and one random PDF I found online, written by pimps on how to pimp or how to traffic victims. And that was very pressing to read. And so it felt like power was on the side of the oppressor, of the trafficker. Going the wrong way. So what does commercial human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation look like in our world? Estimates suggest that around 40.3 million people in our world today are exploited and enslaved. And so this isn't just in sex trafficking, this is in areas like labor trafficking, forced marriage, child soldiers in much of the world. 40.3 million people. And this feels like a big number. It's almost like when you hear about like the lotteries on the radio and it's like $50 million and you know that it's a big number, but you're like, I don't actually know what $50 million really does in practice. So 40.3 million people is more by almost 10 million than everyone who lives in Canada. And 93% of those who are trafficked and exploited here in Canada are actually Canadian-born women and girls who are targeted, recruited, and conditioned for the sex trade by pimps and traffickers. A couple of years ago, I was doing a public speaking event, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Oh, wow, you must speak so many different languages." And I was really confused, and I was like, do I have an accent that I'm unaware of? Like, what is she talking about? And it wasn't until I got home that evening that I realized that when I was talking about my work working with victims of human trafficking, what she thought I was talking about was working with people who were trafficked into Canada, people from places like Thailand or Cambodia or Eastern Europe or South America, et cetera, et cetera. And I wish I had known at the time that's what she was talking about, because I could have told her the majority of people I work with are Canadian women and girls who are born in this country of privilege and opportunity, but recruited based on vulnerabilities by pimps and traffickers. I'll talk a little bit about vulnerabilities, but I would also like to show you a quick video. I'll talk about some of these vulnerabilities first. This video I want to show you, we'll talk a little bit more concisely about what vulnerabilities are and from the mouth and experience of a survivor. People seem to think that, especially church people, seem to think, oh, well, not our women and girls. You know, our girls are safe. They're loved. They come from great families. So yes, other women and girls. And really, pimps and traffickers are so skilled at being able to pinpoint whatever vulnerability they can manipulate to their advantage. So pimps have been known to stay outside of public transit terminals, so like where trains from out of the city come in or buses from out of the city, and it's not super difficult to pinpoint a runaway youth. And so some of the vulnerabilities that they exhibit are they have nowhere to stay. They're running away from something. If things were peachy keen at home or in their home life, they probably wouldn't be running away. And so pimps are able to target those vulnerabilities, self-esteem, belonging, a roof over their head, food, and exploit that for their own purposes. Girls, especially teenage girls who are not desperate, that's the wrong word, but they just long for belonging and for someone to love them and to compliment them and to feed into their lives, those are vulnerabilities that pimps exploit as well. So we're just going to watch, if we go to the next slide, I just want to tell you where these videos are from. So these are training videos that I collaborated with Defend Dignity. It's a program from the Canadian Christian and Missionary Alliance. They developed this video series, and it's about 17 minutes long. If you want to look for it, it's on YouTube, it's free, but then they cut it up into different segments. I'm going to show you 2 out of, I think there's 7 segments tonight. And so that is available online. And then Defend Dignity, they did these videos, they filmed them, they did a wonderful job. And then together we collaborated and developed Exposing Exploitation, which is a 6-module curriculum for anyone who works with youth or knows youth, teachers, youth workers, et cetera, et cetera. It's a 6-module curriculum that you can show to youth that outlines the realities of sexual exploitation in our world today. So we're going to watch the first video, and then I'll come back.
So who is the most vulnerable to sexual exploitation? Abigail is a courageous young woman currently studying law at university and is a survivor of sexual exploitation.
When I was younger, I was about 4 years old, my cousin and his mom and dad, my aunt and my uncle came to live with us. And from the moment that they came to live with us when I was 4, my cousin would sneak into my room and sexually molest me. That lasted till about I was 8, and then he raped me. It created a lot of anger inside of me, and from there my mom just didn't really know what to do or how to deal with me, so I had moved from living with her to living with my aunt for a little bit, then living in foster homes, living with friends' families, living back with my mom, and then back into the shelter. And then finally, at 16 years old, the government allowed me to live on my own on social assistance.
Kids who are not supervised, right? They're given their own space, they're given their own place within the child welfare system. They don't feel like they have a connect to people. They feel like they're kind of just out there in the world. Alike to everyone, they're searching for people that they're going to, belong to, feel safe with, feel that they mean something to. I define sexual exploitation as any type of exchange for any type of sexual act for something. So it could be that the child is exchanging a sex act for drugs, for money, for a ride, for a place to stay, for anything really. That would be my definition.
I'm Detective Martin Dick. I am the lead detective here at the Holt Regional Police Service Human Trafficking and Vice Unit. A lot of these girls are craving something that they don't actually have, so if someone offers them an opportunity that they don't have, or offers them what they perceive to be a relationship that they don't have, and it's easier, or there's less thought goes into making that decision.
One day when I had gone to pick up drugs, my drug dealer him and I were talking about where I was living, my living conditions, and he had said, now that you're making more money, why don't you look for a more comfortable place to live other than this rundown room? I know a guy who owns a home, and I think you'd really like living there. So he got a hold of who would become my pimp. He got a hold of him, and him and I met at a restaurant, and we sat down and we talked, and right away he was extremely charming, extremely beautiful, I just said, sure, I'd love to live with you. And within the next week I had moved into his home. After you've been raped or molested, you already feel impure. So to think that you could sleep with a man for money isn't really that much of it's not that scary.
For the most part, these young people come from backgrounds that perhaps are not the most stable. They maybe have issues in relation to a lack of a father figure within the home. Coming from broken homes, perhaps often we find that they in fact have been victims of sexual abuse as a child. They have witnessed sexual abuse as a child, domestic abuse as a child. They maybe come from a home where alcohol or drugs is a major factor. The average age of entry into the sex trade, certainly from a youth recruitment point of view, is 14 years of age. So when you take that, that's an average. It means that clearly there's children younger than 14 being recruited into the sex trade. We in actual fact have had a number of underage victims of human trafficking that we have found and intervened with here within the region. What I do find is that it's mostly Canadian girls that we find that are being trafficked here throughout Canada.
So I'd like to tell you a little bit about my friend and share a little bit of her story and how I came to know her. And I'll call her, just for her privacy, I'll call her Sabrina. So to back up a little bit, before working for Restorations, I used to work for an organization that worked to provide short-term or emergency crisis services to victims of trafficking. And so we worked really closely with police officers who, in their investigations, would come across victims. And if these victims indicated that they wanted out of the sex trade or away from their trafficker, the police would call us and we would meet them and give them somewhere safe to stay for around 3 to 5 days, with the intention of working with them and identifying other resources and services that they could access for long-term care and support. And it was that trying to connect them to long-term care and support that we had a lot of challenges and hit a lot of brick walls. And that's where I first really felt called to walking alongside survivors for long term. I recognized this need for what we call long-term second stage safe housing or transitional housing for survivors, somewhere where they can receive that ongoing care and support. A lot of people I talk with, especially in the church, are very generous and good-hearted, and they say, "Oh, I have a spare bedroom. I could help a girl find a job. Just let me know." And while that is really well-intentioned, I don't think people quite understand the trauma that survivors work really hard to overcome. Some studies have suggested that the rate at which women in the sex trade experience post-traumatic stress disorder is very similar to first responders and military members. There's a lot of trauma and mental health concerns, and I understand that you've explored some mental health questions in the series that you've done. So this is where I felt really called to the long-term care and support. But while I was working with this other organization, we were referred a young woman from out east, and she had come forward to the police out east and gave a statement about her pimp there. And because of safety concerns, which I'll get into in a moment, because of safety concerns, they all decided, the woman included, to relocate her here in Ontario. And by safety concerns, it wasn't necessarily as much they were worried the pimp was going to go after her and harm her. She was so emotionally attached to her pimp, who she called her boyfriend, that there was fear on both sides. The victim herself was aware of this, and her family and the police, that she would go back to him. On average, it takes about 5 to 7 attempts for women to leave the sex trade before they leave for good. So she came out here to Ontario, and we referred her to a shelter, which was great for her, but she was put in the system that wasn't necessarily equipped or trained to help her with her unique needs as a survivor of trafficking. And so over time, I kind of we had a friendship. It was up in the Toronto area, so I couldn't get to see her all the time, but we would take long drives where she would try to make me listen to her music, and I hated her music. I'm a classical or a country person, and she was really into hip hop, and so we had a lot of conversations about music. We had a lot of conversations about faith. She had one of the Psalms tattooed on her body. What she also had tattooed on her body was her pimp's name, which he made her get. It's a tactic that many pimps use. They'll make her, or either make her or encourage her, because they'll pose as boyfriends. And she had his name tattooed very prominently on her body, and so talked about faith a lot. She would tell me how much she missed her boyfriend, her pimp. And over time, I could tell that she was just being drawn back to the sex trade, and that's what happened. She ended up returning back east and getting back into the sex trade with another pimp who brought her out to Calgary and trafficked her there over Calgary Stampede time. I believe she left that pimp and connected with another one, and she's currently being exploited in massage parlors in the Greater Toronto area. And I tell you about Sabrina because she's very special to me. She was the first person to ever call me mama. I have a 5-year-old daughter, Amy, but I met Sabrina before I ever had Amy, and she's just always called me mama. And we haven't seen each other in years, but when we still text, she'll often tell me, "I miss you, mama." So it's because of women like her who are just caught in the system of exploitation and abuse and emotional turmoil that I feel so drawn to this work. I would like to talk just a little bit, I don't want this to become like a lecture, I would like to talk a little bit about language that I use. You'll have heard in the video the terms trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. These are terms I tend to use. And so just to kind of give you a breakdown, think of the sex trade as like an umbrella. The sex trade is the trade of sexual services, prostitution, pornography, strip clubs, massage parlors, et cetera, et cetera. And within the realm of the sex trade, you have human trafficking, which is done through coercion, force, or fraud. And so you have someone who's a pimp or a trafficker, even if the victim doesn't see them as a pimp or a trafficker and sees them more as a boyfriend who has promised them the world and kind of manipulated their decisions to force them into the sex trade. But you have a trafficker or a pimp who is exploiting them through force, fraud, or coercion. Then you have what is commonly called prostitution. And prostitution is something I define as engaging in the sex trade as a result of circumstances. Circumstances can be varied. It could be deciding to go into the sex trade because of addictions, and there's no other way to feed addictions but to enter the sex trade for that money. It could be single mothers who are having really difficult time making ends meet and feel like they have no other option but to enter the sex trade. I did some training around these issues at Six Nations last year, 2 years ago, and some of the frontline workers there were suggesting that a number of their young boys were couch surfing. They didn't have anywhere to stay, and so they were caught in kind of prostitution, and not necessarily in exchange for money, but for somewhere to stay. And these are circumstances that have kind of brought them to this place where they have no other option. And then you have what you may hear of, it's not a term I tend to use, but you may hear of sex work. And sex work, some people argue, is when people engage in the sex trade because of choice. This is nuanced and difficult landscape here. I in practice, meet people where they're at. And so if someone engaged in the sex trade were to approach me and say that they were a sex worker, I wouldn't say, well, actually, you're really just being exploited and kind of come across in that way. But I have a really difficult time wrestling with this notion of choice for a variety of reasons. First of all, I have a number of survivor friends who have said that when they were engaged in the sex trade, they would have said, yes, I was a sex worker and I choose to be here. And it was only in hindsight that they realized, actually, it was because of lack of choice that I was there. Some women feel a greater sense of ownership over what they're doing if they can say that it's their choice. And I can respect that. But where there's a lot of gray areas is it's not super easy to say, okay, well, this is sex work because it's choice, and this is prostitution because it's circumstance, and this is human trafficking because it's coercion. Another good friend of mine was first trafficked when she was 15 years old. And so she was recruited by a pimp, forced into the sex trade. There are different kinds of pimps. So some pimps will pose as the boyfriend and kind of manipulate the situation, and we'll see a video about that in a moment. Other pimps are commonly called guerrilla pimps, and they use physical force. They use threats, violence, physical force to make a girl stay in the sex trade. And my friend, who was 15 years old when she was first recruited, that was her pimp. And over the years, she kind of lived into the statistic of it takes 5 to 7 attempts to try to leave before she was able to leave for good. And a number of those times re-entering into the sex trade, it was as what kind of call as an independent sex worker. She didn't have a pimp, she didn't have a trafficker. Some would say that she chose that. But again, this word choice is really difficult when it's all that she's known since she was 15 years old, never completed high school, really felt no other option in her life, and felt this draw. So we're just going to watch another quick video. This one is a little difficult to receive. It features a pimp who was arrested for, and I believe he was convicted after this video was made, in the Toronto area for human trafficking. This pimp, I can't remember because I'm picking segments here and there. Oh yeah, it says underneath it. It's this video of the pimp, or the segment that includes the pimp. It was actually done by the Toronto Star. They did a really fantastic investigative series on human trafficking, good articles, complemented by videos, and so I encourage you to find that series.
So, how did traffickers trap young girls?
I got trapped emotionally staying with my pimp, by him telling me that he loved me and doing things that I guess somebody who says that they love them does. Just really made me believe that we were actually going to spend the rest of our lives together, and that he would protect me, and that family that I never had, that protection that I never had, he was going to give to me. And even though I had told myself that love doesn't exist, I thought maybe it does, and maybe this is it.
Matthew Diaco is a Romeo pimp who promised love and security to enslave young girls. Charged with trafficking, kidnapping, assault, and forcible confinement, he awaits trial.
Most of these girls, like I said, they're broken. It's not hard. You just gotta answer their call. You get in there, you find the crack. Like, some are drugs, some are just, they need to hear I love you. It's the illusion. Be there for them. Tell them what they want to hear. And you tell them, well, we need to put money away. I'm gonna do what I do. See, I'm putting my 50 in. You have to do your 50. So, there's another way you can have sex with guys. But don't worry, I'm gonna love you.
And most pimps know that all we want is to be loved. And we'd be willing to do anything to feel that type of love, to feel love. Even though I really believe that I didn't understand what love was, whatever he was giving me, I connected that with love because that's what he told me that it was. And so it was easy for me to work for him and to give him my money and to just do what he told me to do, because he was in return going to give me what I wanted, and that was love.
Knowing someone out there cares. the illusion of it, right? Every girl's had that fantasy wedding in that house with a pink fence. They sell it to her. She'll do it. You just sold her a dream.
So you just said you've sold her the dream. So I'm going to share with you my master's thesis research in 4 minutes. This is the way that...
So, how do traffickers trap young girls?
This is how traffickers trap young girls. They will come across a young woman or girl, and they can come across a young woman or girl, and I say young woman or girl because disproportionately women and girls are exploited in the sex trade. I don't deny that men and boys are exploited in the sex trade, but it's primarily women and girls, and that's who I work with, so that's what I'll be talking about. Pimps will come across women and girls a variety of ways. Sometimes it's like targeted and manipulative, sometimes it's a little bit more circumstantial. There have been articles about pimps being in the mall and trying to befriend girls in malls, online, through different social media sites, different dating sites. Hotel parties is a thing. There's a variety of ways that they can meet vulnerable women and girls. And then it's basically looking at them and determining what their vulnerability is. Is anyone familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? So we all have needs ranging from like the essential needs of, like, we all need water and food to survive, right? And we all need a safe place to kind of live and stay. We need love and belonging, self-actualization. And so they will look at someone and say, okay, this girl, she just needs it all. Like, she doesn't have anywhere to stay. She's a runaway. She doesn't have any food. So he'll be able to provide her all of that. In the case of my friend who was 15, when she was first recruited, she was living at home with her parents, with her family, when she was first recruited by a pimp. And she continued to live at home. She was living at home while also still being exploited by this trafficker. For her parents their marriage was going through a rough time. They were really involved in her brother's recreational hockey. And so they missed some of the signs. They just missed that she was going away weekends, that she was being exploited at night. And so pimps will determine what vulnerability it is that they can exploit for their purposes. Then there is a period of isolation. And isolation happens in two different ways, what I call geographical isolation and relational. And so some of these tactics are very similar to domestic violence and intimate partner violence, where a pimp will start to drive wedges between whatever support system someone has and the woman in question. If she complains about her family or her parents or her friends, he'll just kind of massage that. And then there's the geographical isolation. So human trafficking is very much a mobile crime, to stay away from the gaze of law enforcement, but also to keep a victim out of sorts. Some victims, when they come across law enforcement, they don't even know where they are. And so a pimp will physically bring someone out of the city, so to Niagara Falls on a date, or to a hotel. And so that isolation happens. Then there's often a way of introducing some sort of indebtedness. And so this can happen in a variety of ways as well. So for instance, a pimp might give the girl or woman a ton of weed, and they'll just kind of smoke recreationally, and then over a period of a couple of weeks, he'll say, all that weed I gave you, that wasn't free. You actually owe me X amount of dollars. It doesn't even matter how much money. You actually owe me this amount of money, and I know a way that you can pay me back, and this is how you can do it. Or if he's posing a little bit more friendly as a boyfriend, he'll say, you heard Matthew Diego say, I think he said the pink picket fence. I think that's what he said. I've never heard of a girl dream of a pink picket fence, but whatever. But he'll sell her that dream, like, we could have such a great life together. We could buy a house, you could go back to school, we could travel, we could do whatever. And this is kind of an easy way for us to do this. You can make tons of money. Often they'll use messages like, you're already sleeping with me anyways. You're great at it. Why not just sell it, right? Like you're already doing this anyways. And so they'll introduce either indebtedness or a way of making this kind of a economically good idea to do. And then there's a lot of shame. So there's either this message of, well, you're already sleeping around anyways. Why not just do it for money? Or in the case of a friend of mine who was sexually exploited, her pimps took videos of her being sexually assaulted and then threatened to expose them online. And she was a teenager, and she was mortified at the idea of these videos being shared. She and I do public speaking together every once in a while, and I've heard her say, like, if they were to tell me that now, I would just tell them, give me the video, I'll do it for you. Like, I'll just post it. It's no big deal, like, don't do this to me. But at the time, she was just so mortified of that idea that she did whatever they said. Where are we? Okay. That is a good slide to be at. I just need to get there. I'm just going to read for you again one more time as we wrap up this segment of learning and lament. Ecclesiastes 4:1. Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. So what is our role? What is our role as Christians and as faith communities? I'll have to tell you, kind of one of my own personal cornerstone verses is Isaiah 58:6. And I really like the contemporary English version of it, which is this. I'll tell you what it really means to worship the Lord. Remove the chains of prisoners who are chained unjustly. Free those who are abused. And I love this idea that as Christians, we're called to love God and to love others, and not in just this, I love you kind of way, but in this really active, intentional way of removing the chains of prisoners who are chained unjustly and freeing the abused. That's what it means to worship the Lord. So the role of faith communities is vast. These are three ways that I'd like to talk a little bit about tonight. Belonging. You heard Abigail in the video talk about her longing for love and affection and belonging. And we all have this need to belong somewhere. I hope that in your faith community, you don't just come here because there's good cake from what I saw at the back, but that you actually feel this sense of belonging and a sense of purpose and a feel of community here. And that's what survivors are longing for. One of the biggest challenges in working with survivors and helping them to leave the sex trade is that they're leaving behind everything that they know and love. They're leaving behind pimps who they consider boyfriends. They're often leaving behind other women and girls who are being exploited alongside them. The sex trade is the subculture that they're familiar with and that they feel a sense of belonging, even if it's one that we see as exploitative and harmful and abusive. And so how can we create communities that embrace people who so desperately long to belong? We can be communities of grace. And this is a tough one. So my friend Sabrina, who I was telling you about, who had the psalm tattooed, one of the psalms tattooed on her body, when she was on her way, so she was out east, right? And she was being flown to Ontario. I'd never met her before. I was tasked by the organization I worked with to go and pick her up from the airport. I'd never met her before. I knew she was, how old was she? I knew she was 18, and we had exchanged cell phone numbers so she could let me know where to find her in the airport. And I knew she was really nervous, and I was afraid that she actually wasn't going to get on that plane. I was afraid that she just wasn't going to come. And so through text, I'm saying, hey, I'm Jen, I'm picking you up from the airport, I've got long brown hair, and this is what I'm wearing, and I'm trying to encourage her and to comfort her. And I wanted to tell her that I was praying for her But I didn't know her, and I didn't know what her experience was in church or with Christians, and I didn't want to scare her off. And it wasn't until she landed and we got to know each other a little bit and got to talking about faith, and I shared with her, I was praying for you, and I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how you'd receive it. And she said to me, I really wish you would have. It would have made me feel a lot better. Churches can be places of grace for survivors who have been told by pimps and traffickers, excuse my language, that they are nothing but whores. Churches can be places of grace for survivors who have been told by pimps and traffickers that even if they go to the police, even if they go to family or friends, they've just been in prostitution. Who would ever love anyone coming from prostitution? We can be places of grace for people who are so ashamed of their history and background, and let them know that they are loved. And faith communities can be places of restoration. Restorations, Second Stage Homes, where I work, we called ourselves Restorations not because we have this kind of savior mentality that we can restore victims of trafficking. It's our job to rescue and restore them. We called ourselves Restorations because we saw how our own lives have been restored by Christ. But restoration takes on a lot of different forms. There's the physical restoration of coming out of the sex trade and sleeping sometimes with 10, 15 men in a night, and the physical restoration that your body needs. There's the mental restoration of overcoming trauma and mental health issues. There's spiritual restoration of wrestling with this idea of God. How could God let this happen to me? I talked with Abigail in the video, actually, and we had a really good conversation about she referred to God as her father a lot, and yet I knew that was her own relationship with her father was difficult. And so we had a really good conversation about, okay, how did you get from a place where you identify as a Christian to where you can embrace God as Father? So there's a lot of restoration that churches can help with. If we can go to the next slide, Ecclesiastes. So this one, I kind of feel silly using this verse. So a lot of these slides I developed to do that talk in Iowa that I bailed on. And I had asked another survivor friend leading up to, I was kind of having a mental block, and I didn't know what to talk about. I didn't know where to go, and I didn't know what, the church kept asking, what verse are you going to speak about? And I was like, I don't know. So I asked my friend, what's one of your favorite verses? Just throw your favorite verses at me, and I'll use one. And she threw this one at me. And I couldn't help but think when I read it, oh, this is such a wedding sermon verse. This is, this and, Corinthians about love, this is what you read at weddings. But then I read it and thought about it in a different way. So I'll read the verses for you first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what I think. So Ecclesiastes 4:9-12. And so keep in mind, so the last verse I read was Ecclesiastes 4, verse 1. So this is a little bit later. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. So you can keep the slide up so you can focus on this verse. But I'm looking at the slide of the role of faith communities. And in terms of this verse, I see the survivor as kind of one strand of the cord, God as another strand of the cord, and then us as individuals, us as community as the third strand. Survivors of human trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, they need and they deserve specialized care and support. Just like domestic violence, and our understanding of domestic violence has really evolved over the last 30, 35 years when the first domestic violence shelters were established out of this need for specialized care for this population. we're in the same shift of understanding around trafficking and sexual exploitation, where this population really deserves specialized attention and unique care for their needs. And so I see us as this third strand to come alongside survivors and walk alongside them in their journey. And I'm not here to say that it's easy. I've been kind of throwing stats at you all night. Like the stat, it takes on average 5 to 7 attempts to leave the sex trade. And so one of my survivor friends, I've been walking alongside her as she leaves and returns and leaves and returns and leaves and returns. And it's painful to watch. But I just feel called to just stay the course alongside with her. Is anyone familiar with Backpage, or what used to be called Backpage? Backpage was a website kind of like Kijiji or Craigslist where you could post stuff on there, but it was super common for posting sexual services. That's where people would go to post sexual services. That's where primarily young men would go and look for sexual services. And this one particular survivor friend of mine who I've stayed the course with over the last 8 or 9 years, there would be periods of time where I would go to text her and she wouldn't text me back, and I was like, oh, she's changed her phone number again. Again, she's changed it. She wasn't on Facebook. I had no other way of knowing how to reach her, and so I would search for her on Backpage. The FBI in the States shut down Backpage about a year or two ago, and consequently, it wouldn't work up here in Canada either, and a lot of abolitionists were like, yes, it's a win, it's a success, we've shut down Backpage. And I'm like, well, it's not like pimps are gonna say, Backpage is down, better shut down business, like there's gonna be somewhere else. And that's where I would go and find Michelle. How am I gonna find Michelle now? But over the years, we've just maintained a friendship. Oh, I should have brought that picture. I have this great picture that hangs on my wall at home of Michelle holding my daughter. They're best of friends. My daughter doesn't really know what I do. She just knows that I help people and I'm trying to open this house. But she's in love with Michelle. And sometimes it's just a matter of planting seeds. Michelle once shared with me that she would wait in Tim Hortons after being in a hotel, being exploited in a hotel, and she would wait at Tim Hortons for her pimps to come pick her up. And she'd be dressed kind of what you would imagine someone in the sex trade to be dressed like, even in the dead of winter. And she said sometimes she would sit in this Tim Hortons and families would go by and parents would kind of like shift their child's gaze away from her and they would just kind of walk by. And she said not once did anyone ask if I was okay. And so sometimes it's just a matter of planting those seeds, not necessarily out of this expectation that you're going to save someone, that the person you're engaging with is going to say, yes, I want out, take me somewhere safe. I want out of this life, and, you've saved the day. Not out of that sort of expectation, but planting seeds of love and hope and light. So down the road, when they come to a point where they are ready to receive and jump on that offer for assistance and help, that foundation has been laid down. So I'd like to share a little bit about restorations, which is the next slide. So at Restorations, we're working to provide long-term housing, care, and support for survivors of trafficking. We're working on opening our first home in Aldershot. It will be a 3-bedroom house where those leaving the sex trade can stay for up to 2 years and receive a variety of services and care and support, things like counseling, things like educational development if completing their high school or GED is something that they want to do, or more. Job skills training, life skills, growth and development. There was one survivor I worked with who was in her 30s when she was exploited by a trafficker, and I took her to a grocery store, and this was with the other organization I used to be with. So she was just fresh out of the sex trade, had just left the police station, had only been in our house for a night or two, and I took her grocery shopping, and I could tell she was really overwhelmed, and I was like, oh, this is just, I don't know what's going on, but I can just tell she's overwhelmed. And it wasn't until we left the grocery store that she said, I haven't been in a grocery store in 3 months. This is just this is just all too much for me, all these choices and decisions. And so just life skills growth and development, financial literacy, laundry, gardening. Our house is somewhere that is safe, and so it will be, confidential, security. It'll be specialized, so it will address the unique needs that survivors have. So like I alluded to before, we've tried to work with shelters in the past, and while they've been great temporary options, or not even shelters, I used to refer to an organization that provided housing for women leaving domestic violence. And we both agreed that it just wasn't a great fit. This house was doing the best that they could to offer services and support, but it was just too disruptive in the house for their own clients, and the women I was referring really needed specialized attention. And a supportive place where we can offer services with the full understanding of, or as full as possible understanding of what they've experienced. That's all I have for you tonight. Fairly decent time. I'm a little bit proud of myself. But I'm here to answer questions that you might have. Yes? If I said yes, like right now, that they need help. So that is the hardest part right now. So I was at the True City conference last month, and someone came up to me, and she was really distraught, and she had been out of the sex trade for a number of years, but she was like, what kind of services can I access? And everything I kind of suggested to her, she was like, yes, I've tried that. They have a 6-month waiting list, or I've tried that and it doesn't work. And so here are some resources that could help. But it's really hard because at restorations, we get calls all the time. Like, when are you going to be open? Or they'll think we're open. They'll say, oh, I have a referral for you. And I'm like, we're not open yet. Victim Services through the Hamilton Police is a good resource because they have funding through VQRP, Victims Quick Response Program. And so they kind of have like a pot of money that can help with immediate needs like clothing or cell phone cards or whatever. Short-term places to stay, which isn't always a great option because it's usually in hotels, which is really difficult for survivors to go back to. They do have kind of a pot of money for long-term programming, but that kind of long-term programming is kind of limited as well. But Victim Services through Hamilton Police is a good option. The YMCA in Hamilton has a caseworker that's designated specifically for victims and survivors of trafficking. So the YMCA, I think their program is specific though to youth up to like 24 or something like that. So it's also limited. I believe the Native Women's Center also has some designated beds for. So Native Women's Center has a shelter for women, and I think they have designated beds for victims and survivors. I think that is still ongoing. Haven't spoken with them in a while, and women don't have to identify as Indigenous to access those beds either. Those are probably the 3 top resources in Hamilton so far. Police is always, I'll always ask someone if they're interested in talking to the police, and often they're not. Not always, but often they're not for a variety of reasons. They either fear the police because of what pimps and traffickers have told them, like, oh, you're just gonna get in trouble. Often victims too are manipulated into engaging with other criminal activities. So people providing sexual services, selling sexual services, can't be criminalized in Canada anymore unless they're selling at or beside a school, a daycare, or a park, but that's an aside. But they'll often get kind of roped into other things like drug trafficking or fraud or theft, things like that. So pimps will say, oh, if you go to the police, you're just gonna get in trouble. Or they just have a bad experience with police. And that's difficult because from kind of like stepping back and looking at the issue from like an advocacy and policy standpoint, the more charges, the better, the more convictions, the better, and just kind of creating or developing a system where where there's a precedent for being able to charge and charge and convict traffickers, but I'm also not going to force people to go to police if they don't want to. But it's always an option. Yes. I've had good and bad experiences personally. Law enforcement, I will say that law enforcement has undergone a lot of training over the last years, even over the last 5 or 6 years. But it all depends. Like, sometimes the training is limited to just vice units or detectives, and not always like the front line, like the patrol police officers who still, I'm making a little bit of a generalization here, but some law enforcement officers still work under this assumption that women are choosing to be in this, and will use derogatory terms to talk about these women and girls. But I've also had really positive experiences with police who go above and beyond in connecting and developing relationships with victims, like giving professional, not their personal, but like professional cell phone numbers out, being able to refer them to services. So I've had both good and bad experiences here in Hamilton and outside. Yes?
When you were saying that it takes like up to 7 times for them to actually leave, and you get them the first time around and they go back, do you do anything on your end to try to bring them back for the second time, or do you wait for them always to initiate to say, I want to get out of this?
Yeah. So I'm thinking, especially with my friend Michelle, I would usually initiate, but not in a like, hey, are you ready to leave yet? Just a, hey, I'm thinking of you. How are you doing? It's not with this motivation of getting her out again. It's with this motivation of caring for who she is as a person and just maintaining a friendship. So as for restorations, like when we are open and operational, we're still discerning what our policies will be if a woman decides to leave and then, a week later says, oh, like that was a choice I shouldn't have made, like I want to come back. So policy-wise, we're still figuring that out, but if I'm talking about like relationship-wise, I have no problem initiating a response or initiating contact just out of care and concern.
So in your experience, what's the best approach when you know someone's in it and, it's like trying to get an addict to admit they have an addiction? Do you say that the best thing is to wait for them to initiate, or you just, what's the best method is basically my question.
I think there's nothing wrong with saying, is there anything I can do to help you right now? And seeing where that goes. Because they could say, like a friend of mine, she was still in the sex trade, but she was really interested in completing her GED and going back to school. And I said, hey, would you like me to set up a tour at Mohawk? And we can just go and check out Mohawk College and just see what that might look like. I think are there any social workers in the room? One of my biggest learnings over the last, I first started this work in 2011, so 8 years, I used to operate from I will do anything and everything within my power to get this person out. And that has not always worked well for me at all. And it's hard. It's hard when you have a 15-year-old who says, I just want to go back to my boyfriend. I'm very sorry. Excuse my language. It's an essential part of the story. I'm not just using it willy-nilly. I worked with a 15-year-old at the other organization I was with. She had left her pimp, and she had been back into contact with him. And she said, he used to tell me, you're my bitch first and my girlfriend second. But I just talked with him, and he said, I could only be his girlfriend. He's okay with that now. I'll just be his girlfriend. She's 15, right? And it's like, I want to do everything to be like, no, you're not going back to him. But she was going back to him, right? And the only thing I could do in that moment was say to her, you know what, if there comes a time, because I think there will come a time, but if there comes a time where he changes his mind and he tells you that that's off the table and you're his B first and you got to get back to work, like, I'll be here for you. And I never heard from her again. So I think there's a couple practices that have worked well for me. One of the practices is kind of anticipating what's coming next and voicing that and saying, and not from okay, this is what's going to happen, and when it does, I told you so and call me, but just kind of letting them know, like, this isn't my first rodeo. This is probably how he's going to operate. I know that. Deep down, you probably know that. And when it happens, there's no shame about it. No, I told you, like, you can pick up the phone, you can text me, don't call me. You can text me and I'll be here. So that has worked for me, and not wanting to do anything and everything for someone. Realizing that they are individuals who need to make their own choices, and you are there as a friend or as a supporter or an encourager or a mentor or a coach or however you see yourself, family member, who is there regardless, but boundaries. Yes. In a nutshell, what I've learned in 8 years is boundaries. Okay, I'll go there and then there. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you if you've ever beat up a kid, but what I mean is, have you ever had a confrontation with a pimp, by accident or on purpose? Or?
This is my favorite story. So Michelle, who my daughter knows and loves. I should have brought Michelle here. Michelle and I have this wonderful story of ups and downs. She hated me. She turned other girls against me because she hated me so much, and we had a falling out, and then we reconnected and all this stuff. So we had a falling out. I became pregnant with my daughter, and Michelle found out, and she was really happy for me. She had called me. She apologized for this whole falling out we had. I had Amy, and I had heard through the grapevine that Michelle was back in the sex trade. So I reached out to her, and I said, hey, I'll take you out to Starbucks. Let's meet up at Starbucks. So Amy was probably about 3 months old, and we're sitting in Starbucks, and I could tell Michelle was going to work that night. She was dressed a little bit provocatively and lots of makeup, and but we're sitting there and we're talking, and she started getting really antsy all of a sudden, and I look up, and her pimp, I knew it was her pimp just from her behavior and just the way she responded. He walked in and around me and came and stood right beside our table. And it wouldn't have been that awkward, except I was nursing Amy at that exact moment. So I'm sitting there nursing my 3-month-old daughter, and I kind of didn't know what to do, because I was like, is he here? And I have vague recollection. I've asked Michelle since, and she's like, oh yeah, this happened. He shook my hand. We shook hands, and Michelle stood up and walked out with him. So that is the only time I've really engaged one-on-one with a pimp. It was kind of surprising. I get asked a lot, aren't you afraid that they're going to come after you and your family or whatever? And yes, pimps are violent individuals. I'm not concerned for my own self. There are numerous vulnerable women and girls out there to target and recruit, even if one of their women leaves. And I also feel, and this is where I really respect Michelle as well, despite the experiences that she's been through. When Michelle and I speak publicly, she is always advocating for grace and care for pimps and Johns, which I really admire from her, and I think the church can learn a lot from. I can't tell you the number of churches I've been to where people have approached me afterwards and have said things like, all pimps should die for what they do, right? In churches. And I can't help but think, yes, I know this is coming from a place of turmoil and grief and needing to wrestle with this tough topic, but we're also the church, which is supposed to be a message of grace and love and redemption. So I really respect Michelle for advocating for us to think about what What brings men and boys to a place where they can pimp and traffic other individuals? That's not work I'm feeling called to, but yes.
My question was, you did mention at one point that one of the girls, or I don't think the words, but how could God have let this happen to me? And I guess as a church or as an individual, if that moment, how can you respond to that?
Wish I hadn't taken your question. So this is something. This is something I wrestle with a lot too. I've not been exploited or sexually assaulted. My own personal story is my husband and I struggle with infertility, right? And so this idea of, okay, God blesses other families with children. We're lucky to have Amy, but like, why is God withholding blessings from me, right? And so I think we are all in a position where we can think of our own lives and think, God is doing this for other people. Why is he not doing it for me? Or why is this happening to me? My message to a girl would be that it's not God who's doing this to you, that there is sin and there is evil in our world, and God's heart breaks for what's happened to you. And there are much more complex theological answers than that. But I think emphasizing the love and the grace and the hope of Christ rather than like, God has this. One of the messages that could probably be the most hurtful is God has a plan for you through, like, God planned this for you to make you stronger. Or God planned this for you so you could share your story. Or God planned, like, and I think there can be redemption in our stories, and I think that we can use our stories and use our experiences, but that is not a message I would emphasize first and foremost to someone experiencing pain and hurt. I would emphasize love and grace, and that God grieves with us. I wrote a devotional for Lent 2 years ago around this topic, Hebrews 6 something, about how Christ, the very Christ who suffered on the cross, knows how we suffer. And I think that there can be a lot of power in that, knowing that Christ also suffered horrifically, and so Christ, out of anyone, knows what we go through. Does that make sense? I didn't go to seminary. Ask me a stat about trafficking. No. Thank you. This is not mine.
Thank you. Just before you go, I have one last question. That's the privilege of being the pastor with the mic. What's, if you were to kind of share the stats of just Hamilton alone, of women being sexually exploited or sex trafficked, in the kind of the pimp culture, are you able to kind of, do you have any definition of that? And maybe where in Hamilton, we just learned it's all over Hamilton,
Yeah.
but kind of the concentration of where this is happening in this city?
Yeah. Stats off the top of my head, I know I've collected them from Hamilton Police for different resources I've written. Off the top of my head, I can't remember. Hamilton Police does have a human trafficking investigation unit, and so there have been a number of investigations, charges. In Hamilton, is anyone familiar with the Domator case that happened back in 2009? So in 2009, police charged, I can't remember how many, essentially the largest case of human trafficking in Canada's kind of criminal history, or legal history, happened in Hamilton. So over 20 Hungarian men were trafficked into Hamilton and forced into labor trafficking. And this is a story that I think shocks a lot of people because it happened in not, if you're to think of Hamilton and think about where crime happens, right? But these victims were kept by their traffickers in really lucrative houses up in the Meadowlands. And so, you know, if you don't know anything about trafficking, you might think, oh, okay, well, you know, probably happens on Barton, or it probably happens, you know, in these what, you know, our neighbors would call sketchy areas. But it really can happen anywhere, including the Meadowlands. I did a tour with youth once, and we went to like a high school, and we talked about the average age of entry into prostitution, and we went past the strip club on Barton, and then we stopped at the hotel on Upper James, the Marriott, I think, to expand this notion that trafficking happens in seedy or sketchy places. You heard Martin, I can't remember if he says in this video or if I've just heard him say it elsewhere, but every single hotel and motel in Halton has had trafficking happening in it. So kind of the seedy motels to the, you know, the five-star hotels. So it can really happen anywhere. But of course you see it visibly, like it can be a hidden crime because it's happening behind closed doors, but then of course you have like street prostitution. So then it's a little bit more exposed, but it can really happen anywhere.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you for having me. Oh, and I have a table at the back with resources, and I'd be happy to answer any questions back there too.
I think that's what we're going to do now. I think we're just going to break. That's pretty heavy material, of course, and important for us to kind of process at some level. There are snacks back there. There might even be, yeah? I think we're going to sing after, so because we do have something else that we need to do right when we get back. Oh, is the coffee not ready? Yeah, that's good. So I changed the whole course of this evening, but we have a few things that we have to get processed, and I think some of our necks are dry. So, at least mine is. So you're going to be excused. We'll get back together in about 5 or 10 minutes, but please avail yourself of that opportunity to talk to Jennifer and to go to that table that's nice.